Well, good morning. Welcome to those joining us in person here and online to this discussion at Hudson Institute, where scholars research, analyze, and make recommendations that embrace American leadership, global engagement in the furtherance of security, freedom, and prosperity. What we're going to do now is I'm going to turn the floor over to my colleague here, Patrick. He will introduce our guests and then begin with the first series of questions, and then we hope to save some time at the end for questions from the audience. So with that, Patrick.
Well, Rebecca, thank you very much. What a great pleasure it is, as Rebecca Heinrichs has just suggested, to have Ely Ratner and Lindsey Ford here from the Pentagon taking some time out. If you were looking for the best person possible for the Defense Department of the United States to take on the pacing challenge of China, you would look quickly to someone like Dr. Ely Ratner. I mean, his academic pedigree, his research pedigree, what he's done before in terms of the White House, working for the Vice President, then Joe Biden as Vice President, but also at the State Department back in the great days of Scarborough Shoal, working on the Office of China-Mongolian Affairs. He's been there thinking about these issues, constantly writing about them, so it's a really great pleasure. And we're going to ask Ely to kick things off here with brief comments, but first let me just say a few words about Lindsey Ford, because we're also delighted. She's an exceptional public servant who's also been thinking about these things analytically at places like Brookings in the Asia Society Policy Center or Institute. But she's got experience working in the Office of the Secretary of Defense on the things she's doing now and she's in charge of as the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for South Asia and Southeast Asia, things like the first U.S. ASEAN, that's the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, Defense Ministerial. That was something she designed, thinking about the maritime strategy when you're thinking about the South China Sea. So we're really dealing with people who have been at the cutting edge for especially the past decade or more on these critical issues.
So I want to take us back to the conversation, Ely, about specifically these operational, very dangerous, reckless behavior on the part of the PRC. And you talked about how it's driving ally interest and willingness to collaborate more, but that's very good. But how are we responding to these? How are we leading with our allies in response to these, in collaborating to some extent on how restraint to be, and sort of how we're talking about that? And then also, what are we doing and what are we saying, or what are we trying to communicate then to the PRC when these events happen? And then relatedly and more broadly, how are our crisis communications, our lines of communications, to try to prevent unintentional challenges? Or otherwise, it seems to me like they're kind of picking a fight. How would you respond to that?
Well, I don't think they're picking a fight. They may be trying to coerce and bully, but they're not picking a fight. I think they're smart enough not to do that. And that's an important distinction. What we say privately to the PRC and what we say publicly is exactly the same in response to these activities, which is, number one, we will not be coerced and we will not be bullied if that's what your intent is. And number two, we will continue to fly, sail, and operate wherever international law allows. I think sometimes for folks that sounds trite, but in this instance, it's fundamentally important and fundamentally true. And so we have continued our operations in the face of this activity. We have not drawn it back in the face of this coercion, nor have we hyper-amplified it in response. We are going about engaging in operations that we believe sustains the rules and norms of the international order, and frankly, I think the world looks to us to do that, and we are continuing to ensure that these kinds of activities are not going to create artificial or illegal no-go zones for military, much less economic activity in the region. So that is the message privately and publicly, is we're going to keep flying and sailing, operate, and we're not going to let this behavior intimidate us. As it relates to the issue of mil-mil relations and crisis communications and engagement with the PLA, I will say we are not where we think we need to be. The Secretary met with Minister Wei, his counterpart at the time, at Shangri-La for the first time last summer. He met with him again on the margins of the ADMM Plus when we were out in Cambodia in the fall. Of course, President Biden has been meeting or speaking with President Xi at times, and they have shared the view that military-to-military relations are an important channel to keep open. And that has been Secretary Austin's message, which is despite ongoing tensions. It's incredibly important for the U.S. and the PRC military to have open lines of communication, but the problem is that the PRC and the PLA continue to use mil-mil relations in those channels of communication as a means of signaling displeasure over issues related to security and not. And so they will turn off for extended periods of time and be unwilling to engage at times when we think it's important for us to be talking. So for instance, you may have seen on the day that we brought down the PRC spy balloon over the waters above South Carolina, immediately Secretary Austin put in a call request to the PRC to say, look, these are the kinds of times when we need to be talking about what our intentions are, what our perspectives are. That request for engagement was denied, and we've seen similarly with Chairman Milley, on other occasions with Secretary Austin, similarly with Admiral Aquilino, as well as some of our working level dialogues that are meant to manage the Paul Mill part of this, our DASD, Michael Chase's dialogues, as well as some of the operational dialogues that Indo-PACOM holds with the PLA, that they have turned all of that off for now. And we think that's destabilizing and dangerous, and we think we both ought to be doing a better job of managing it.
That's great. And then if I can just real quick then for Lindsey too. And I say pick a fight though too, not necessarily for it to escalate, but to cause us to do something that they could point to us and say, look what they've done. They've done, like what they did even in the case of the spy balloon. We shot it down over our own airspace and then they accused us of violating international norms. But I've just got, since you brought up the spy balloon, let's just stick with spy balloon for just a minute if we could and talk about.
Let me find my spy balloon card real quick.
Well, I thought it was really interesting because in the Pentagon briefings, kind of right after this happened, there was a little bit of a teaser, or a little bit of a talk about the potential of revealing more about what the Chinese are doing sort of globally in other countries that did not know that there was surveillance, UAVs and spy balloons flying over their own territory, maybe some dishonest activity on the part of the Chinese of not revealing this is what they were doing, commercial activity, but they're using it for military purposes. So can you speak to that too, and also just with partners in the region who don't want to pick and choose, but maybe this is something that they, if it is going on in their airspace or in their country, that they should know about. Just a little bit about that for both of you.
Yeah. So just quickly on the surveillance balloon. I mean, I think the first thing to say is this was a surveillance balloon. Period. Yeah. Okay. There is no ambiguity about this. The equipment on board was for intelligence surveillance. It was equipment that's inconsistent with weather balloons or whatever they were claiming it was. This balloon is part of a broader fleet of capabilities that we know the PRC has developed to conduct surveillance operations. And as you mentioned, we know that these balloons have flown, surveillance of balloons have flown over more than 40 countries across 5 continents. So this was not just an isolated incident. And have not heard a plausible explanation for this activity. I will say, I think embedded in your question there was what's our understanding and sort of why haven't necessarily we've been saying more about it. I think one of the important parts of this is because of the nature of the spy balloon. This is inherently an intelligence issue that is being handled as such in terms of the ongoing work associated with it. Obviously, much of the balloon itself and the associated equipment was recovered in salvage operations and is being examined very carefully now by the FBI and other elements of the intelligence community and the U.S. military. But we want to do that carefully, and at the appropriate time, we'll be able to share the findings associated with that.
I guess I would just add to, not on the spy balloon specifically, but there is a pattern that I think a lot of Indo-Pacific partners are very familiar with, where you see the PRC do something that very clearly violates sovereignty, in this case of the United States, in many other cases of other partners. And then there's a bit of an effort to, with talking points and whatever, say, this is fake news, nothing to see here. And this is where I think we believe it's incredibly important, not just in private conversations, but publicly, to shine a light on what's actually going on and to make sure that the facts are actually out there.